Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I will tell you about the HOA that demanded access to private property of a person who is not even a member of this HOA. My name is Miles. I'm 28 years old, and a few months ago I made what I thought was the best decision of my life. I bought my first home. It was a sprawling property with a large pool, something I dreamed about for years. After years of grinding in tech consulting, this house felt like the reward I'd earned. The house had belonged to a retired teacher, Graham, a kind man in his 70s who told me he was downsizing to a quiet condo near his kids. During the sale, Graham casually mentioned that he had always been friendly with the neighbors, but I didn't think much of it. That all changed one Saturday afternoon. I had just finished setting up patio furniture when there was a loud knock at my door. Opening it, I found a woman in her mid-30s, holding a clipboard and flanked by two kids clutching pool floaties. She introduced herself as Kimber, a neighbor, and informed me that her kids were ready to use the pool. Confused, I asked what she meant. She rolled her eyes, sighed loudly, and explained that everyone here shares the pool. Kimber spoke as if it was obvious, as if I had signed some invisible contract. When I told her I wasn't comfortable with that, she shot me a nasty look and muttered, "Graham never had a problem with it." I didn't think much of the interaction, just an entitled neighbor, but within days, other people started showing up. Some knocked politely, while others just strolled into my backyard uninvited. It was baffling. When I tried to set boundaries, the rumors started. The neighbors said I was selfish, unkind, even breaking community rules. And then came the HOA. The next time my doorbell rang, I wasn't caught off guard. I half expected another neighbor, but what I got was far worse. Standing there was a sharply dressed man in his 40s, introducing himself as Victor, the president of the Homeowners Association. Victor had an air of smug authority, the type of guy who assumes everyone will do as he says without question. He wasted no time before launching into his spiel about community expectations. According to Victor, the previous owner, Graham, had an understanding with the neighborhood, allowing residents to use the pool as part of some unwritten tradition. I calmly explained that there was no mention of this arrangement in my property deed or during the sale process. Victor waved my concerns off, insisting that Graham's generosity was a cornerstone of the neighborhood's spirit. "And now, as the new owner," Victor declared, "it's your responsibility to honor that tradition." My patience was already wearing thin. I asked Victor to provide some proof, something in writing that supported this so-called agreement. He smiled thinly and promised to have the paperwork delivered soon. The next day, Kimber was back. This time, she had a crumpled sheet of paper in hand, a photocopy of what looked like a flyer. It was titled Community Pool Days and listed vague rules about when neighbors could access the pool. There was no signature, no official stamp, just a line at the bottom reading, "As always, thanks to Graham." I stared at the paper, incredulous. "This is your proof?" Kimber's smug grin faltered. "Well, everyone knows about this. It's how things have always been." I handed the paper back. "Sorry, Kimber. This isn't legally binding, and I'm not comfortable with strangers using my pool." Within hours, the real harassment began. Notes were slipped under my door. My trash bins were mysteriously overturned. Random people glared at me on the street. It was as if the entire neighborhood had turned against me overnight. The final straw came when Victor sent an official-looking letter on HOA letterhead, claiming I was in violation of community standards. They were threatening to take legal action. I couldn't believe it. A lawsuit over my own property? The absurdity made me laugh at first, but it quickly sank in that these people weren't bluffing. They had convinced themselves that I owed them something, and they were willing to fight for it. I wasn't going to let them win. If they wanted a legal battle, I'd give them one, but I'd fight smart. That's when I hired Morgan, a property attorney recommended by a friend. Morgan was sharp, confident, and most importantly, unimpressed by the HOA's antics. "Let me guess," Morgan said after hearing the story. "They have no written agreement and are banking on intimidation?" "Pretty much," I replied. Morgan smirked. "Classic overreach. Don't worry, Miles. We'll handle this." As we prepared for the case, Morgan unearthed some interesting details. The HOA, as it turned out, had a history of bullying new homeowners into compliance. Their bylaws were vague, full of loopholes, and heavily skewed in favor of the longtime residents. It became clear that the pool wasn't the real issue. The HOA was testing me, seeing if I'd fold under pressure like so many before me. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. As the days dragged on, the neighborhood's hostility became impossible to ignore. Kimber and her cronies were the worst. I'd catch them standing on the sidewalk near my property, loudly complaining about how selfish I was. "They'll get their way," Morgan assured me after I vented about the harassment. Bullies like this always crumble in court, but Victor wasn't backing down. A week later, I was served with official papers. The HOA was suing me for violating community standards and causing irreparable harm to neighborhood unity. I couldn't help but laugh when I read it. Irreparable harm? Over a pool? Morgan didn't share my amusement. "This is more serious than you think," she said. "Their strategy is to bleed you dry with legal fees. They're counting on you giving up before this ever gets to trial. If that was their plan, they didn't know me very well." The HOA had hired a big-name law firm, which only confirmed my suspicions that they were overfunded and underregulated. Meanwhile, Morgan began piecing together a solid defense. We combed through every HOA bylaw, every piece of correspondence they'd sent, and every interaction I'd had with Graham during the sale. It didn't take long to find holes in their case. For starters, there was no written agreement, just vague references to Graham's supposed generosity. Secondly, Morgan discovered that the HOA's budget had recently been stretched thin. They were funding this lawsuit using money that should have gone to common area maintenance. Morgan's real breakthrough came when she dug deeper into Victor's leadership. It turned out he'd been involved in several shady dealings, including unapproved alterations to his own property that violated the very rules he was enforcing on others. "Classic hypocrite," Morgan muttered. "We're going to bury him with this." Meanwhile, my own life felt like a battlefield. I installed cameras around my property after finding my car keyed in the driveway. Someone even threw an egg at my front door. I was furious but refused to stoop to their level. The harassment wasn't just personal, it was financial. I started receiving ridiculous fines from the HOA for supposed infractions like improper trash bin placement or failure to maintain landscaping. It was obvious they were trying to drain me, but I paid them just to avoid giving them any ammunition. Morgan encouraged me to document everything. "Judges hate petty tactics like this," she said. "The more they push, the worse they'll look in court." Despite their pressure, I stayed calm and focused. Every ridiculous fine, every harassing note, and every hostile glare only strengthened my resolve. Victor underestimated me, and he was about to learn the hard way. The day before our court date, Kimber appeared at my door again, this time with an older woman I hadn't seen before. The woman introduced herself as Deborah and claimed to be representing the concerned neighbors. Deborah tried a softer approach, speaking in a tone that dripped with condescension. "Miles, we'd like to resolve this amicably. Surely you understand how important this pool is to the community." I stared at her, incredulous. "You're suing me and you think I'll just roll over?" Deborah sighed dramatically. "No one wants this to drag out. Think of the children." I smiled coldly. "I already am, that's why I'm fighting." Her expression soured, and Kimber muttered something under her breath as they walked away. The next morning, I stood outside the courthouse with Morgan by my side, ready for battle. Little did they know, I'd come prepared with more than just legal arguments. I had a surprise they wouldn't see coming. This wasn't just about winning anymore, it was about sending a message. The courtroom was packed, with nearly every seat taken by neighbors eager to see the spectacle. Some whispered among themselves, throwing occasional glances my way. Kimber sat near the front, her smug grin firmly in place, while Victor adjusted his tie like he was preparing to deliver a groundbreaking speech. Morgan leaned over and whispered, "Relax, they'll make fools of themselves the moment they open their mouths." The proceedings began with the HOA's attorney, Clark, laying out their case. He painted me as an unreasonable newcomer who had selfishly dismantled a cherished neighborhood tradition. According to Clark, my actions had caused emotional distress and undermined the community's cohesion. Victor took the stand next, adopting a tone that was equal parts rehearsed and self-righteous. "This isn't just about the pool," he declared dramatically. "It's about the values that make this neighborhood special. Graham understood that. Why can't Miles?" I clenched my fists under the table, but Morgan placed a calming hand on my arm. "Just wait," she murmured. When it was our turn, Morgan wasted no time dismantling their arguments. She started by pointing out the obvious. There was no written agreement. This a tradition, as the HOA calls it, exists only in their imaginations, she said, her voice firm. She then presented the property deed, which made no mention of any community access to my pool. The HOA's own rules state that agreements of this nature must be documented in writing and signed by all parties, Morgan explained. There's no evidence of that here. The judge nodded, clearly unimpressed with the HOA's lack of documentation. Next, Morgan called Graham to the stand. I hadn't spoken to him since the sale, but he had agreed to testify after hearing about the lawsuit. Graham, with his kind demeanor, explained that he had allowed neighbors to use the pool occasionally, but had never formalized the arrangement. "It was just something I did to be neighborly," he said. "I never intended it to become an obligation for anyone else." Victor squirmed in his seat, visibly uncomfortable as Graham's testimony undermined their case. Then Morgan played her trump card, a recording of a conversation I'd had with Graham before buying the house. In it, Graham explicitly stated that the pool's use would be entirely up to me as the new owner. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the recording played. Even Kimber's smirk faltered. When it was my turn to testify, I described the harassment I'd endured. Uninvited guests, vandalism, and even frivolous fines. Morgan presented photos, video footage from my cameras, and copies of the fines to back up my claims. By the time Morgan finished her cross-examination of Victor, the HOA's case was in shambles. She revealed discrepancies in his statements, including how he had violated HOA bylaws with unapproved renovations on his property. Victor's credibility crumbled under the weight of his lies. The judge's expression shifted from neutral to outright disapproval as the evidence mounted against the HOA. When it came time for the judge's decision, it was swift and decisive. "The HOA's claims lack any legal foundation," the judge said, her tone sharp. "Not only is there no enforceable agreement regarding the pool, but the HOA's behavior in this matter has been entirely inappropriate." She dismissed the lawsuit in its entirety and, to my shock, awarded me $25,000 in damages for the harassment I'd endured. The judge also issued a warning to the HOA about misuse of funds, hinting that further investigations might follow. As the gavel banged, the courtroom erupted into whispers. Kimber stormed out while Victor sat frozen, staring at the table in front of him. Morgan turned to me with a triumphant grin. "Told you they'd fall apart. But I wasn't done yet. I wasn't just going to walk away with my damages. I wanted the HOA to pay for their arrogance. Victor and his team had started this war, but I was going to finish it." The victory in court should have been enough, but as I walked out of the courthouse, I realized I wasn't satisfied. The HOA had gone out of its way to harass me, waste my time, and make my life miserable. I wanted more than vindication. I wanted accountability. Morgan was the first to suggest a deeper look into the HOA's activities. "Victor's been sloppy," she said over coffee the next morning. "I'd bet money he's done more than just misuse HOA funds. We need to dig." That's how I met Cal, a no-nonsense private investigator in his early 40s. Cal had a reputation for uncovering skeletons in closets, and he didn't disappoint. Over the next few weeks, he unearthed a treasure trove of HOA misdeeds. It turned out Victor had been dipping into the HOA's budget for years, funneling money into consultation fees that mysteriously ended up in his personal account. He'd also been giving out landscaping and maintenance contracts to his friends, who charged double the going rate for subpar work. But the biggest revelation was about the pool itself. According to Cal's investigation, the HOA had pressured Graham for years to formalize the pool's community access. Graham had resisted, even writing an email to Victor saying, "This is my private property and I don't owe anyone access." This email was gold. Not only did it prove that the HOA knew they had no legal claim, but it also painted Victor as a manipulative bully. Armed with this information, I decided to escalate. I filed an official complaint with the local housing authority, outlining the HOA's financial mismanagement and presenting the evidence Cal had gathered. I also sent anonymous tips to a few investigative journalists who covered housing scandals. The fallout was swift and brutal. Within weeks, the housing authority launched an audit of the HOA's finances. Victor's misuse of funds came to light, and he was forced to step down as president. Several neighbors, realizing they'd been duped, turned against him and demanded answers. Kimber predictably tried to spin the situation, claiming she had no idea about Victor's actions. But no one believed her. Cal had found emails showing she'd been one of the beneficiaries of the inflated contracts. To add insult to injury, the local news picked up the story. The headline read, "HOA President Faces Mismanagement Scandal After Losing Court Battle." The article detailed everything, from their failed lawsuit to the financial audit. Victor's reputation was ruined, and the HOA's remaining leadership scrambled to distance themselves from him. Fines that had been issued unfairly were refunded, and new leadership was installed after a special election. Meanwhile, I used the $25,000 I'd been awarded to install high-end security around my property. Cameras, motion sensors, even a reinforced fence. I made sure my home would never be anyone's playground again. As for Kimber, she avoided me entirely after the scandal broke. The few times I saw her outside, she quickly turned away, her face red with embarrassment. But the sweetest revenge came from the community itself. Neighbors who had sided with the HOA began apologizing, sheepishly admitting they'd been misled. Some even thanked me for exposing the corruption. For the first time since moving in, I felt like I could breathe. The war was over, and I'd won, not just for myself, but for anyone who'd ever been bullied by power-hungry HOA leaders. Still, I wasn't planning to open my pool to anyone anytime soon. My property was my sanctuary, and I was going to keep it that way. But the HOA, they'd learned a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. With Victor ousted and the HOA in shambles, life in the neighborhood changed dramatically. The new HOA leadership was much quieter, more focused on actual community maintenance than imposing arbitrary rules. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was living under a microscope. One afternoon, as I lounged by my pool sipping lemonade, I decided to throw a small party. Not for the neighbors, of course, but for a few close friends who had supported me throughout the ordeal. I made sure the party was private, sending out digital invitations and hiring a security guard to keep out any uninvited guests. Kimber passed by my driveway during the setup, her eyes darting toward the decorations and catering van. She looked like she wanted to say something, but she quickly shuffled away when the guard glanced in her direction. The party itself was a celebration of resilience. My friends toasted to my victory, laughing about the absurdity of the HOA's original claims. "Who sues someone over a pool?" one of them joked, raising their glass. After the party, I sat by the pool alone, the quiet hum of the water soothing my nerves. I thought about everything that had happened. The lies, the harassment, the absurd lengths Victor and Kimber had gone to, and smiled. In the weeks that followed, more news surfaced about Victor. The Housing Authority's investigation had uncovered additional financial mismanagement, including funds that were never accounted for. Victor was hit with a lawsuit from the HOA itself, as the new leadership tried to recoup some of the money he had stolen. Kimber, meanwhile, faded into the background. Her reputation in the neighborhood was tarnished, and she no longer strutted around like she owned the place. My victory wasn't just about winning in court. It was about standing up to bullies and proving that no one has the right to trample on someone else's rights, no matter how entitled they feel. The HOA had tried to make an example out of me, but in the end, I was the one who set the example. And my pool? It stayed exactly what it was meant to be, mine. If they wanted a community pool, they could build one themselves. As the dust settled, I realized the fight had taught me something deeper than just standing up for my rights. It showed me the importance of not backing down when faced with injustice, no matter how absurd or overwhelming it might seem. Victor and the HOA's attempts to intimidate me had failed spectacularly, but the journey wasn't without its toll. For months, I had been on edge, constantly defending myself and my property. It wasn't easy, but in hindsight, it was worth every moment of stress. One day, as I was cleaning the pool, an elderly man from the neighborhood, Walt, stopped by. He leaned on the fence, hesitating before speaking. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for how things went," Walt said. "We all should have known better than to follow Victor. That man fooled a lot of us." I nodded, appreciating his honesty. "Thanks, Walt. It's over now. Lesson learned, I guess." He gave me a small smile. "Not many people would have stood their ground the way you did. This neighborhood needed a wake-up call, and you gave it to us." After Walt left, I felt a small sense of closure. While I didn't need anyone's apology, it was good to know that at least some people understood the bigger picture. Months later, the HOA elected an entirely new board, with stricter rules about how funds could be used and far more oversight. While I kept my distance, I heard from neighbors that the new board was focused on improving the community rather than enforcing arbitrary rules. The scars of the battle remained, a scratch on my car that hadn't been worth fixing, and a few awkward run-ins with Kimber, but life moved on. My pool was mine again, and my peace of mind had returned. I upgraded the backyard, adding better landscaping and even a small fountain near the pool. It was a place I could finally enjoy without worrying about uninvited guests or frivolous lawsuits. In the end, I didn't just win against the HOA. I won back my freedom, my dignity, and the respect of those who had doubted me. This house, this pool, was now truly my home, and no one would ever take that away from me again. Friends, thank you. See you soon.